The Yoga Sutras provide a comprehensive guide to meditation, breath control, and samadhi. This series is about how to use the Yoga Sutras in your mindfulness practice.
Today, I will talk about the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras. So we're still with the Yoga Sutras. This chapter is called the Sadhana Pada. Sadhana is a Sanskrit word for practice. This chapter is really for most of us who are bound, limited in some way, caught in the circumstances and experiences of life that can bring suffering. This chapter talks about the causes of suffering, the way to relieve suffering, and practical steps towards freedom from suffering, liberation. This was really also talked about at the same time by the Buddha, who said, everyone suffers, suffering has a cause, and suffering has a cure for so you can be free of suffering. So it's same time, same place in India, talking about very similar ideas. Suffering comes in many forms, from things like back pain to lack of sleep, depression, anxiety, not knowing who you truly are, and maintaining your ego view of yourself is suffering. Change brings suffering. Being uncertain about the future, your goal, your main purpose in life, these are all examples of what causes our suffering. We are encouraged by society and by force of habit to cling to life's material things, seek happiness from them, and to identify with our bodies and individual egos rather than opening to our higher self within. We look for happiness from things and people and activities rather than from within ourselves. The idea for most of us is that with active participation through choosing and acting, we can begin to bring about change. Most of us are caught up in our patterns and are not mindful of them. The idea that through practice and through specific kind of action, we can begin to transform our patterns and break our attachments and identifications, which are at the root of most of our problems. We can get to the root of our suffering, then clear up the pattern that brings this suffering about. So this is really something that meditation brings about. Suffering is characterized by the term avidya, which we heard last week. And avidya translates into ignorance or misunderstanding about the nature of who we are. We mistake what brings us happiness. We mistake the unreal for the real and the not self for the self. A great example is what happens looking in the mirror. And what do you see? Most people say they see themselves, but you don't see yourself. You see a reflection of your body. And uh, You identify with this body, and you identify with the character, the ego in the body. And so you see that reflection as a reflection of who you are. But what you really see is a reflection of a body, and this does not show who you really are. The second chapter of the Yoga Sutra talks about not only the sources of suffering, but how to overcome them. Three ways are talked about for this. The first is the way of action, kriya. The second is the way of knowledge, jnana. And the third is the way of devotion. This is yoga, though, and yoga is really the path of action. And through action, we are able to not simply to reinforce our existing dysfunction, our existing ignorance, but rather we can open ourselves to new possibilities. If you act and move without consciousness of your patterns, you'll reinforce those patterns. When we act and behave without self-consciousness of how we are acting and behave, we follow pre-established patterns, our conditioning. We act out our conditioning instead of responding to the moment. One example is being in a bad relationship and leaving, and a few years later, finding ourselves in another relationship with the same problems because we haven't become reflectively self-conscious of these patterns. Now, like yoga, meditation starts out as action, something you do, even if doing is sitting there and being quiet. That's still an activity. As meditation gets deeper, it becomes a path of knowledge, of jnana, as you start to see yourself more completely. This seeing yourself more completely is one of the things that brings around real, deep, and lasting change. Chapter 2 addresses becoming conscious of our patterns and learning to move and act with awareness, to act and move with mindfulness. Verse 16 of chapter 2 tells us that suffering from pain that has not yet arisen is avoidable. They say you can avoid future suffering. The way out of suffering is through the cultivation of unbroken discriminative awareness, or knowing the unbounded self. In a world of uncertainty, where life brings changes that can cause fear, yoga and mindfulness meditation are paths to ease our afflictions and to lead to self-realization, to lead to the deepest peace.
You want deeper meditation, more peace, more happiness. Subscribe now to continue to find ways to get more from your meditation.